Until the age of 10, I lived with my grandmother and grandfather in the village of Finland region. The village was old and small, with only 7 streets. Almost every yard had different animals, but absolutely everyone had chickens. At least 2. But they were there. My relatives had a whole army of these feathered creatures. At the time of the events described, my friends and I were about 10 years old. We lived like ordinary rural children. In the summer, we caught fish in the pond. In spring and autumn, we helped with household chores and harvesting. And in winter, we went to be generous to our neighbors. But one summer, a boy came to us from the city with his family, Kostya. He was 3, 4 years older than us, wore round glasses, and all the pockets of his shirt and trousers were stuffed with napkins. Kostya didn't communicate with any of us villagers, and we weren't particularly eager to get to know him. We only knew that he only went out for walks after sunset. It's no wonder that the nickname Vampire stuck to him. After some time, neighbors of Kostya's family began to complain that their chickens were disappearing somewhere. They decided that it was a weasel or a marten that had gotten into the courtyards. They let the dogs out to guard the chicken coops, but it didn't help. The chickens continued to disappear, but not only from Kostya's neighbors, but also in other yards. Moreover, neither locks on the barns with chickens nor the owner's patrols reduced the number of disappeared birds. After a few more days, people noticed that mostly black hens and grouse hens were disappearing. At this point, the grandmother started to let loose their tongues, saying that this was not good. The witch, they say, settled in the village. And since the only visitors we had were Kostya and his parents, everyone began to look askance at them. Soon all the nigella and hazel grouse were gone, and the remaining chickens began to disappear. Only these heads remained in the courtyards. At this point, everyone began to shout, and my friends, Petka, Tonka, and Tolik and I decided to confront our vampire and ask what nonsense was going on here. And so, after waiting for sunset, we went out into the street and almost immediately ran into Kostya. Out of surprise, all 5 of us stood rooted to the spot in silence. Then Tolik, who was our leader, decided to break the silence and asked directly where the bespectacled man was doing with his poultry. Kostya shrugged his shoulders, saying, "I don't know," and moved on, skirting us. After that, I and my friends kept an eye on the newcomer every evening, but he stubbornly didn't notice us until one moment. On another summer evening, Tonka and I sat with her and drank tea. We couldn't keep an eye on the vampire because the boys had gone to the hayloft, and therefore we simply looked at the 2-story house in which Kostya lived. It was already closer to midnight, and a couple of street lights were lit. I waited for my grandmother to come for me, since I was not allowed to walk in the middle of the night, alone. And suddenly I saw Kostya's dad in the window, coming out from behind the gate with a large knife, more like a saw. His son followed him, for some reason, in tears. The father said something to the boy and returned back to the house, and the latter trudged along the street. Then I imagined myself to be a great spy, and while Tonka was running to the kitchen for sweets for tea, I ran out of the house after Kostya. I tried to walk as quietly and unnoticed as possible, but in the darkness, not far from the place where the guy stopped, I stumbled and fell into the grass. Kostya looked around sharply, but when he saw me, he relaxed. He came up to me, extended his hand, and helped me stand up. All this happened in silence. Then he simply turned around and moved on. Thinking that I had already gone so far and had nowhere to retreat, I ran up to the boy and asked if he was stealing chickens. Kostya shook his head negatively and continued walking somewhere. Then I asked, "Who could it be?" The boy showed some kind of sign with his hands, without slowing down. At this point I got angry and, standing under the lantern, asked why he wasn't talking to me. Kostya stopped, turned, looked at me sadly, and opened his mouth. I still remember this moment with horror. A stump of tongue fell out of Kostya's mouth, blackened by some kind of infection. The teeth were covered with some kind of yellowish-green coating. It wasn't a human mouth. It was a garbage pit. With a silent scream, I ran back home to Tonka. They were already searching for me, and there I was, with a terrified and tear-streaked face. Everyone rushed to ask what had happened to me, but I remained silent. In front of my eyes was Kostya with his mouth open and sad eyes. That night I couldn't sleep. In the morning I decided not to tell anyone anything for now and try to figure it out on my own. The next evening I had to sneak away from my grandmother because, after yesterday's incident, she didn't want to let me go. But I was determined not to give up, and after waiting for sunset, I dashed out onto the street where Kostya lived. Before running away, I grabbed a pen and some sheets of paper, hoping that the boy could write. Soon Kostya came out, pressing a napkin to his mouth. Now it was clear to me why he needed them. Waiting until he moved away from the house, I went out to meet him. He was clearly surprised to see me. I apologized for yesterday's panicked escape, explained that I came alone, and handed him the paper and pen, asking him to write down what had happened to him. Kostya wrote for quite some time, then handed me the sheet and went on his way. Later at home, I read that Kostya's parents were involved in occultism. Until he turned 12, he didn't know about it, as everything was kept hidden from outsiders. On his 12th birthday, Kostya came home and saw his parents in some incomprehensible attire. His father explained that he and his mother worshipped the god of death, Ish-Tabu, and their son must be sacrificed. After that, Kostya writes about how he screamed and tried to run out of the house, but his parents managed to grab him and drag him into a room. He doesn't remember anything else. He woke up already mute. Now he only knows that his parents are planning something again, some kind of ritual, so every evening they put the boy out the door. As I finished reading this letter, I ran to my grandmother and grandfather and told them the whole story. After that, everything was like a dream, waiting for the police and ambulance from the nearest village, searching for and arresting Kostya's parents, who had fled from the authorities and hidden in our village before that. Kostya was taken away somewhere too. Now I think to the hospital, to a psychiatrist. After that incident, rumors spread that Konstantin was not the first son, but you can't be sure about that. I left a couple of days after the events described above and never returned to the village. My grandmother and grandfather sold the farm and went to the Carpathians to some relatives. More than 8 years have passed since that terrible night, but sometimes I dream of Kostya nodding his head. Maybe he's saying, "Thank you" to me?